Hey guys, it's Mitch. How's it going? We're looking today at another title from the 2012 relaunch of Extreme Studios, back when they were putting out their old properties only with a new, distinctly indie flavor. So today we're going to take a look at Glory, number 23. So while there had been a Glory comic that had run for 22 issues, obviously that comic had nothing to do with this one. That was like 12 years before this and was essentially a completely different character. So why are we going with issue 23 here? Well, because this is around the time when Rob Liefeld is first experimenting with legacy numbering. So this is Glory number 23 because there had been 22 issues of a comic with the title Glory put out before it. Just as the Prophet relaunch started with number 21 and Youngblood started with number 71. Because we're pretending there's a legacy there. So the story behind Glory is, it's going to be pretty short. She's a Wonder Woman ripoff. You know, Rob Liefeld came up with her in the early days of Youngblood, and she was going to be a straight Wonder Woman analog that he could slot into. I think probably her first appearance was in Youngblood Strike File number 1, because we were flashing back to the old days of the Allies, when Die Hard was Captain America, and Super Patriot was kind of Superman, and Glory was Wonder Woman. The character got reworked a little bit in the mid-90s to get its own title. I believe that was written by Joe Duffy, which surprisingly was not really much of a bad girl book, probably because it was written by Joe Duffy. Well, I guess that's really what Rob Liefeld had Evangeline for. The next time anybody saw Glory was in 2001, briefly. And to say the next time somebody saw that book is actually maybe a little bit of an exaggeration, because next to nobody saw that book. But there was 3 issues of a Glory comic put out by Avatar Press using repurposed scripts that had been bought by Rob Liefeld from Alan Moore. And this was from the days when Alan Moore was working to rework the entire Extreme Studios line into Awesome Entertainment comics. The concept he came up with for Glory was actually kind of the early beginnings of what he would later develop into the comic called Promethea. And we're actually going to hit that fairly shortly too, just to kind of get an idea of what the bridge exactly is between Glory and Promethea. But the version we're going to look at today is out of the 2012 rebrand, where Rob Liefeld was taking the properties that he had left over from Extreme Studios and Maximum Press and Awesome Entertainment, and looking to repurpose them to try and, basically to try and license them off as IP again, because that's really the business model for Rob Liefeld, ever since, 2001. You know, these days Rob Liefeld is one of the wealthiest creators in comics, but it ain't from making comics, it's from selling off those properties. And the reason for the relaunch, in 2012, Image was turning 20 years old. So there was that. There was a big celebration where they were doing all sorts of commemorative books. And, Eric Stevenson, who was, I think, the publisher probably at Image Comics at the time, decided that they needed to include Youngblood in some capacity and reached out to Rob Liefeld. The thing is, this was 2012, and, at that time, nobody gave a shit about 1992 Extreme Comics. Image didn't put out anything like that. Honestly, the kind of stuff that Image was putting out in 2012 was more indie-oriented. You know, the most successful examples of that would be like Saga or Walking Dead, but there was an awful lot of that kind of thing going around at Image at the time. So Eric Stevenson seems to have approached Rob Liefeld with the idea of trying to repurpose the old Extreme Studios properties into indie darlings. And this part is largely supposition, but the way he seems to have convinced him to take part in the event was to point out that in 2012, all sorts of comics were being licensed for movie and cartoon and TV show deals. You know, it wasn't just the big name superheroes that were getting into movies anymore. It was also small independent properties like The Walking Dead, like Kick-Ass, like Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. And he seems to have been able to convince Rob that if they could get some indie darling creators behind these books, they could come up with completely different versions of the properties, kind of shining up their image and making them newly attractive as licensing IP once again. We've already taken a look at Prophet, which was originally a 90s extreme-type Captain America, and transmuted that into, John Carter of Mars meets Conan. You know, it was a very pulpy book that had a very European look to it. And they were going to do this with all of Rob's properties. You know, they did this with Bloodstrike, they did it with Supreme, kind of. They did it with Youngblood, and they did it with Glory. So with Glory, the way they decided on their creators, they took kind of a similar path to what they did with Prophet, in that they took low exposure independent creators who had started to gain some notoriety. You know, on Prophet, it was Brandon Graham. On this one, the, I suppose, big name creator was, at the time went by Ross Campbell, since then goes by Sophie Campbell. So we'll just go with Sophie. And Sophie Campbell had built up a bit of a name, doing all sorts of like slice of life comics that talked a lot about gender and sexual orientation, centered a lot around women, and featured a lot of different body types. So very, LGBTQ type comics, which is not something anybody would ever associate with extreme comics in any way, really. But apparently it was Brandon Graham, the writer of Prophet, who reached out to Sophie Campbell, stating that she would be perfect for this particular job. And apparently when Sophie Campbell found out that, this was going to be reworking, like an Extreme Studios job, she thought it was a prank from Brandon Graham. Because, there's no way that Rob Liefeld wants me to draw his character. But Sophie was lured over with the promise of, being able to do whatever she wanted with the character and, the money. She needed the money. And from interviews I've read at the time, apparently Rob Liefeld was behind them 100% of the way, which Sophie Campbell was kind of shocked by. The writer in this case is a guy named Joe Keating, who didn't really work in comics very much. Well, that's not the right way to put it. It didn't really write comics very much before Glory. He'd been working at Image for quite a while, actually, largely in the public relations department, doing marketing and sales, although he had also spent time as a flatter and had edited Pop Gun, which won a bunch of awards. He'd also managed to work in a little bit of writing on the side, writing a couple of short stories for Next Issue Project and The Ant, and he got at least one in Savage Dragon. So Glory kind of represented a chance for him to take the plunge and become a full-time writer. And apparently he had the complete backing of Eric Larson on this. Eric Larson was very much in his corner for this particular rebrand. So I guess he was a very good PR guy. So now we're going to get to see what, a guy who has almost never professionally written and an artist who focused largely on independent slice of life books can do with a 90s Extreme Cheesecake character. So here we go with Glory number 23. Let's start with the cover. Honestly, I like this cover quite a bit. I think it's a great issue 1 cover. This is, you want to introduce the main character, that's a great way to do it. Get a pretty big shot of the character themselves. Show that there's a pretty drastic redesign in the character in all sorts of ways. The most obvious one, I suppose, is the build. We're not going for the sleek supermodel look anymore. The kind of hot extreme lady of the early 90s, So this version of Glory is much more muscly and extremely scarred up, and she's going to get more so. We've also got to change the costume, which is much more warrior-like, really. Doesn't try to be revealing in any way. Does kind of say Amazon, but in kind of a mix between functional and, absolute Batman, really. I particularly like the piece of, rebar sticking out of her elbow here. That's pretty cool. And we've got her standing atop a pile of, vanquished monsters and demons, with all sorts of, splattered goop all over them here, indicating that this was a pretty bloody fight. So we're actually promising quite a bit with the cover here. The first statement, obviously, is this is going to be a very different Glory, and she's going to have very different kinds of adventures that maybe skew a bit more brutal. I'm okay with that, absolutely. I don't mind the choice at all to go with no background in this particular case, because I think a background would probably take away from the main figure. This is much more stark and striking. I don't mind it at all. Also, like the new font as well. Again, more kind of like a Conan type of look, or that, that kind of thing anyway. The old Glory font was way too old school, and, particularly focused on Americana. That's not going to have anything to do with this comic, really. Maybe peripherally, but not really. So anyway, let's get into it here. We can start with talking about the changes to the character, because they are going to hit us with them pretty quickly. So we get our front page here, which is a pretty cool one. It begins here an all-new chapter in the centuries-spanning saga of Glory. Yeah, we're getting Sophie Campbell really likes to focus on having a whole bunch of hair on Glory. And kind of a futuristic version of the barbarian armor that she had on the cover. It got a future sword and everything. That's good looking shit. Don't mind the pose at all. No, honestly, there's already good stuff going on. So the way that we're going to kick things off is with an origin for Glory. This is going to be a brand new origin that doesn't really have anything to do with previous versions of the character. So in this iteration of the character, Glory is the product of two ancient tribes that were battling each other before the Earth was formed. So they are, I suppose, an alien race, or at least that's implied. Glory's mother came from a race of warriors. Glory's father came from a race of essentially demons. And they've been at war for millennia, and the only reason that the war came to an end was that her mother and father eventually made a truce and kind of brought the houses together, and Glory was sort of the promise of that continued peace. And the art style here is pretty good, I gotta say. It's pretty heavy on the detail, at least when it has to be. So when you get this like opening shot here with the two sides at war, we are going to get all sorts of noodly detail with all of the combatants in the background here, but then only the main figures really get colored. And this woman off to the side. I don't know if that was necessary, but sure. No real focus on shadow here, but that's intentional. And I mean, this is like mythic retelling stuff anyway. So now we're going to get to Glory several years later, let's say, when she's living with her mother, and she's saying how she's going to be leaving the house. Glory appears to be like an 11-year-old girl, but over the course of the conversation, we learn that she's actually about 500 years old. And during that 500 years, she's been raised to be the leader for both tribes. Or if she can't lead them, she's been trained to put down whatever tribe is rebelling against her. And the thing is, she's not yet ready to lead because her mother is still in charge of the people and probably will be for several thousand years more. And there doesn't seem to be any indication of when a war might break out. And I mean, if it took her 500 years to look 11, it might be another 500 before she's actually properly full-grown adult size. And during this time, while she's been training, she's become fascinated with Earth. So she's decided that she's going to leave the house and go live among the people. And we get a little bit of a montage scene of her suiting up. Kind of cinematic, we get the shot, get a credit, get the shot, get a credit. I think we did something similar in Prophet as well. We're really pushing that, man, this would make a great movie. And I honestly kind of like the dynamic between Glory and her mother, where, the mother still treats her very much like a child. You're not ready to leave the house. Again, even though she's 500 years old. And it doesn't really seem like she matures that slowly. She's undoubtedly immature by the standards of this race. But, she has still been accumulating knowledge all this time. And I imagine can make decisions based off of what she's learned. The art style's gotten a fair bit simpler, really, from the opening page. And this is going to be more in line with what we're going to see for most of the comic, really. In fact, Glory herself isn't going to have a huge role in this first issue. So the cover here may be a little bit misleading, at least for this issue. Maybe later on in the series she's more like that, but anyway, we're going to cut to World War II. This is obviously after Glory has traveled to Earth. And I mean, probably lived among them for a couple hundred years at least, because she seems to be more like a teenager at this point. Although, a particularly buff-looking teenager. And she's fighting on the side of the Allies, destroying, Nazi tanks. So we are kind of getting back to the Allies. The original team was Supreme and Super Patriot and Die Hard. Although we're only going to see Supreme and Die Hard in this issue because, of course, Super Patriot isn't owned by Rob Liefeld. And while Erik Larsen is taking part in Rob's return to Image at this time, I think Rob is probably very wary about having any properties that he doesn't own in his books. So anyway, yeah, we get Glory here smashing a tank. Pretty cool looking shot, really. We've got a few dead Germans lying around. Some of them got pretty much splattered by the looks of it. Again, we don't mind showing some gore. That's all right. And after Glory seems to be wrapping up, oh, she busts a German over her knee. Yeah, the Americans come up and they're like, good job, Glory. We really appreciate the fact that you're not punching our tanks. So you think you'll join us for some Captain America type PR after the war's done? And she's like, well, no, I'm not actually fighting for America or anything. I'm just beating up on Nazis because that's the right thing to do. And it's interesting seeing these panel-to-panel progressions because, it's just a very different kind of book from what you would expect. If you're like, here's Glory number 23. It's definitely a very indie look. Sophie Campbell seems to like a pretty wobbly line when it comes to these faces. It looks like she can control it fairly well, at least. Doing both pencils and inks, so that's all right. It gets a bit smoother when it comes to Glory here, I think when it comes to most women. And that's kind of going to be it for Glory for most of this issue. So this is going to be our protagonist for the rest of the issue. This is a girl named Riley, who's apparently a journalist of some kind, and she got obsessed with Glory early. When she was a little kid. Talking with her friend here on the swings, saying Supreme's a big dumb jerk, Glory could totally beat him up. And later on as she grew up, there were other things that distracted her, but every night when she went to sleep, she would dream about Glory. So this opening sequence here is probably a sequence that she's dreamed before. And she's been dreaming about Glory adventures, yeah, like all her life. And it kind of progresses, like linearly. And, when she's an older kid, she's like, one day I'm going to find out what happened to Glory, because apparently at one point Glory disappeared. And she's gotten to that point in her dreams. And what always happens is the linearness just stops for a second and it restarts. And she has to start again from the beginning. So we're going to get another flashback to World War II. Yeah, we're going to get a couple in this, I guess. And this is going to be Glory after a battle where she gets confronted by Supreme. This version of Supreme seems kind of like a cross between the Superman-style Supreme that Alan Moore wrote and the Extreme Studios Supreme from 1992, drawn by Brian Murray. He's not an out-and-out psychopath by any means, but he's not super friendly either. And he's talking to Glory, and they're talking about which way the war is going. And, how the war appears to be finally coming to an end. Supreme notes how a bunch of super people seem to be popping up, and it seems to be kind of coincidental. He's keeping his eye on them as closely as he can. He says, I kept my eye on them all, closely observed how they acted and predicted their intentions. I analyzed their strengths, judged what they're capable of, and determined their role once the war was over. And he says, only one thing was made clear, I don't trust them, any of them, especially you. So his issue with Glory is basically that she's reckless and can't be controlled. He particularly doesn't like the fact that she seems to thumb her nose at authority and he's never seen her take orders from anybody. So that's something that people should do. I could see a Superman type character being a little bit concerned about that, although this is kind of the crux of his argument here. And Glory's response is, well, no, of course I'm not going to take orders. I'm thousands of years old and I'm the heir of these two ancient cultures that were bred for war. And ultimately what it comes down to is I don't give a shit what anybody tells me to do. I don't give a shit what you think of me. I'm sticking around on this planet and I'm going to do what I think is right no matter what. And Supreme doesn't really say much of anything it's kind of like he's been shamed into silence, which is all right. It's definitely on the girl boss side of things, but I'd say with justification. It's more Supreme's lack of response that I have a bit of an issue with, but yeah, sure, whatever. It fits with the narrative, so we'll go with it. And at the end of it, she kind of brushes him off and floats away. And Supreme is kind of left grumbling and watching her go. And yeah, okay, that's it for that flashback. So now we're cutting back to Riley. And this is the bit where she's kind of saying how she's been dreaming Glory's adventures over the years. So we get some stuff that seems to be like it might be from the 40s, 50s, 60s, around there, where Glory is saying how she couldn't have stopped some evildoer without the help of the danger damsels. We got Glory here as a puppet. She's like, how can I possibly help the Allies now? We got her in a fight with Die Hard and at some kind of murder scene, like an explosion murder scene, something like that. At the end here, we've got Glory covered in blood, yelling, I'll stop you, Silverfall, no matter what it takes. And now we're going to cut to present day. So this is Riley these days, and she's made her way to France, some island in France. And she's walking down the street at night, comes across some nice old dude who luckily speaks English. Apparently she's looking for a place called the Bar Mornay, and he corrects her to, you mean the Brasserie Mornay? And maybe? And, you look at the backgrounds here, again, we're going very, kind of like indie crossed with European style. Again, kind of similar to Prophet Number 21, only just a different variation on it. And this is going to be very kind of slow moving stuff, kind of on the decompressed side of things, but at least people are talking through it, so that's okay. As Riley is led into this little bar, tiny little hole in the wall, and she's introduced to somebody who, Mr. French guy here, thinks can help her out. It's another transplanted American. And he calls out to her and he's like, Gloria, there's somebody waiting for you here at the bar. And we're meant to be like, oh shit, is that Glory? And then she comes out. It's like, well, that's nothing like the girl that we saw earlier. Maybe if she's been shrunken over the years, she does seem to have a scar across her throat. And I guess Gloria and Riley are going to go take a walk outside and have a bit of a discussion. Storytelling here is all fine. It's all talking head stuff anyway. So the focus that you have to have is on switching up the angle from shot to try and keep things a little bit interesting. And I think that that's accomplished. The background is pretty faithfully done from panel to panel. There's no real slacking going on. There's a couple of panels where there's no background, but that's only because they're pretty small panels and background would just kind of clutter things up and make it a little bit less clear in those cases. So I think that's well done. And as they're leaving, Gloria says to Riley, I know who you are, Riley. We've been expecting you. So it tells her to meet her outside. And so Riley's just going to kind of wait out in the snow. That's a nice shot there. You know, from a high angle, get all the footprints in the snow. That looks pretty damn good, actually. And after a little bit, Gloria comes out and they're going to have a little bit of a chat. You know, after a little bit of pleasantries, Riley's like, you knew I was coming? Gloria's like, I try to make it easy for you without being obvious. Every story or rumor you've heard, we planted. We don't know who we is, obviously, yet. We would have contacted you directly, but there are a lot of people we don't want finding us. And Riley's just like, okay, who's me? Who's we? Who's us? Are you? And Gloria's like, am I Glory? No, I'm not, but I know her. So they're like, okay, we're making some progress. That's good. Yeah, these backgrounds all look pretty great. And good consistency on the character models from panel to panel, too. Oh, we're going to do another cutback. I keep thinking we're out of flashbacks. Like, I read this not too long ago. And I remember it being like, okay, Glory showed up in the middle, and then we had a long stretch where she wasn't in there. And that doesn't really seem to be the case. No, they did a decent job of, like, peppering her throughout. Because this is a Glory comic. She's not, like, in the present-day continuity, but we are getting a fair bit of her backstory, at least. So this is at a time when Glory has been living among humans for probably a few hundred years. That she needs to experience what it's like to be one of them. She says, humankind is a young species, one which has accomplished so much in their very limited time. I've lived with them, loved with them, and fought with them, but I feel I've never truly understood what it means to be one of them. And then quick cut to Gloria, who's pouring coffee somewhere, and all of a sudden, I'm not sure, this could be explained a little better, but it appears to be that Glory got put into like a Thor situation, where her consciousness was inserted into Gloria, and she could transform into Glory at times. And it seems to start out as like visions that she quickly realized were actually happening or had happened, something like that. It's interesting, because like I said, this isn't clearly explained, but it does kind of rely on like a shared comic book knowledge. Like this is the kind of thing that happens in comics, where two beings eventually come to a point where it's two consciousnesses in one body. And so, yeah, no, we've all read that comic for sure. I mean, I read Sleepwalker, didn't you? Yeah, so we get the line here saying, well, I still led my regular life with Glory existing in my subconscious. She would often take over, and, well, I can't convey just how great it was to live as her. So, I mean, when Glory takes over Gloria's body, then Gloria is still apparently conscious and, you know, able to experience everything that Glory is experiencing. So I imagine that it's sort of a reciprocal relationship there. And that's the whole deal with Glory experiencing humanity. And apparently it ended because one day Glory just stopped taking over. Now, we do get some pretty cool shots of, like, you know, very truncated adventures with Glory taking on monsters. That's a great shot there of her wrestling some kind of giant snake thing. Good shit. And again, don't mind getting gory, where she kicks off some Cyclops' head. And once Glory was gone, she was gone for good, where Gloria thought that maybe she'd left Earth. You know, maybe by the same method she got there in the first place. And it got to the point where she got kind of obsessed about it, where she was doing the thing that Riley was doing, where she was like constantly researching where Glory might have gone or how she might have got there. And it kind of took over her life to the point where everything else kind of fell by the wayside. And she, you know, she lost her job, she lost her place, she abandoned her friends, and she used all the money she had left to go, apparently to Fort Wayne. And all the time she was traveling, she had this feeling tickling in the back of her brain like Glory was maybe still in there somewhere. But, you know, couldn't confirm anything because Glory wouldn't come out. And I guess we're at Gloria's place here. This is a pretty great looking page, really. You know, the style isn't really to my preference. Obviously, you know, like if it was up to me, I would pick something quite a bit more dynamic and over-rendered, right? But for what it is, it's a well-done version of it. You know, we're picking good angles for everything here. She doesn't seem to have any kind of problem with the overhead angle, which can be a tough one. We got a bit of a lower angle down here, and then another switch to a higher angle, and seems to be picking the appropriate times to go with the high angle shot. Anyway, they get inside. Gloria's like, I'm telling you all this because almost 5 years later, I felt something. It wasn't the same, but she was there, however faint. And she asks Riley to take her shoes off. As Riley's taking her shoes off, she looks out the window, sees some like werewolf-looking thing lurking out there. Gloria comes back and says, are you okay? And she's like, I guess I am. So we're just not going to talk about the werewolf that's like hanging out in Gloria's backyard. Sure. I'm sure that will come back around again. It does seem a little bit odd that nobody says, hey, look, that's a werewolf. I think we can infer that it's not odd for Gloria, but Riley should probably be like, yo, I don't know werewolf things. So that's That's strange, right? Anyway, she's going to follow her upstairs because apparently the story that Gloria is telling is more captivating than Werewolf at Your Door. Okay, so this is the story of how Gloria got to France and the reason she came to France at all, to this little island that like 40 people live in this village, is because she sensed, I suppose, that Glory was here. You know, again, scrounged up everything she could, used whatever favors she had left over from the friends that would talk to her to get a plane ticket to France. And she says, once I got here, everything kicked into overdrive. Riley's like, how so? Says, life got much worse real quick. Luckily, I had some unexpected help. So that isn't going to be helping us too much. It looks as though Gloria was maybe kidnapped by maybe members of that demon race or some other monsters. Who knows? We saw from the cover that Glory fights monsters of some kind. And it looks like that werewolf that was hovering outside the door maybe rescued Gloria from the monsters. Hard to tell, though, because that's all the description we're going to get. That's for later on in the story, I suppose. And she says, they got me to where I needed to go, but things got better, but they never got good. So I guess the they is the we from that was spoken of earlier. Like, we kept sending you messages, that kind of thing. And that does indicate that, it's not just about the werewolf, it's also about some other entities that may also be werewolf-looking things. And we end with Riley here saying, you found her though, right? You found Glory? Didn't she help you? And Gloria's like, well, yeah, here's the thing. Glory was broken. And now we're going to cut to Riley finally finding Glory after all these years. And Glory appears to be on her deathbed pretty much. Just all bandaged up, got herself an IV, got a respirator going. Gloria says someone did something really, really bad to her, and I think they're coming back. And that's where the issue's going to end. And we get our preview for Glory number 24. That's a crazy looking cover anyway, for sure. As well as previews for Prophet number 22, Bloodstrike number 26, and Supreme number 63. We will go over Supreme number 63. I think I've got Bloodstrike number 26 coming. Now I got to make sure on that one. I don't think we're ever going to be able to hit Youngblood number 71, unfortunately. Or at least not for the foreseeable future, because it seems to be next to impossible to get a copy of that. All right. And yeah, just kind of, again, showing like the kinds of titles that Image is putting out at this time. So like the Activity and Artifacts and Between Gears and Near Death. And like, I've never heard of any of these titles. Mondo, which I assume has nothing to do with Generation X. Pigs, Queen Crab. Oh, there's Walking Dead. I know that one. Shit. And Witchblade number 153. Fuck's sake, dude. I don't know how that book lasted that long. Sure. But yeah, obviously much more of an indie flavor these days. All right, so that is Glory number 23. Honestly, it leaves me very much in the same way that Prophet number 21 did, where I'm intrigued, although like not necessarily excited for the next issue. It does seem pretty apparent that Joe Keating has a story in mind for Glory, and it does seem that he's setting up a few twists, so I dig that. I like that we're doing a very different take, and it looks as though Sophie Campbell can handle like both the walk and talk stuff and the action stuff, at least in a way that works for her style. I'm all right with all of that. I do have more issues of Glory on the way, so I do kind of want to check those out. I don't know if I'm ever going to put up more videos on it, but I will at least, be able to see what it looks like later on, so that's cool. The look for Glory herself is going to change a fair bit. Like, this seems to be kind of a median version. We had the little kid version. This is like the teenage version. We are going to get an older version of Glory, or a more evolved version, where she's like a 9-foot-tall albino Amazon that is just a mountain of muscle and scars, and with 2 gigantic pigtails. Which, again, is a very different look from what we've seen on Glory before. And, again, it's intriguing. I get the impression there is some pretty violent action when it gets there. So I guess it comes down to whether or not the plot is good. The plot in this one isn't bad, although it is very drawn out. I'm not sure if this is the best way this could have started, whether or not it might have been a better idea to start with just like a straight adventure and then go into the origin issue. I don't know. I think it works anyway. But this does feel like the beginning of a movie or TV show, which of course is, feels intentional. If the whole purpose of this reboot is to switch up these properties so that they're more attractive to investors again, then yeah, we absolutely do want a Glory TV show one of these days. You know, if we can turn this into the next Walking Dead somehow, then we're absolutely going to try that shit. And I don't blame him for that, for sure. In terms of how the comic did, in terms of the numbers, not great. It very much like how Prophet did, where I don't think more than 7,000 copies of a single issue was ever printed. So that's pretty rough. Rob, of course, will say that the books were a success regardless, because, Rob will always say that, no matter what. Because the books were collected into paperbacks and hardcovers, and those are still available to the public, and they're obviously still available to be licensed. And of course, they were eventually licensed as part of the Netflix deal back in 2019. That deal's expired now, though, so nothing ever came of it. But of course, you can always, give it another shot. I'm sure Rob would be open to it. The book itself lasts for about 12 issues, which is like, it's okay, not great. When you're only putting 7,000 copies of a book out on the shelf, I get that. Doesn't seem to have won any major awards, but it did get a lot of critical acclaim. Like, a lot of websites will put it on the list of, like, best reboots of, the 2010s, something like that. I know I had people comment on my Prophet video that they loved this particular version of Glory. It was, like, one of their favorites. And they were undoubtedly weirded out when they decided to look into the backstory of the character and found out it was just another Extreme title. For me personally, I kind of dig it. Again, I'm intrigued. I can't really make a final judgment without having a better idea of how well the story was executed, I'd say. So actually, before we wrap up, this is an insert, maybe obviously. I was planning on putting the video out as it is, but then I got an order in that I wasn't quite expecting to get here in time, so we can actually go over a little bit of where this comic is going. This is from issue 25, so this is just 2 issues down the line, which is important to state because it sure seems like a lot further. So, already we're seeing what the advanced version, the more advanced version of Glory is going to be. This issue is all about, like, the far-flung future of 500 years from now. And I guess this is Riley dreaming Glory adventures, only she's in this one. And she's absolutely ancient, but being somehow maintained. And apparently the thing that she's hunting down is Glory. And in 500 years, Glory has metamorphosed, essentially. She's, like, evolved much further along than what she was to become much more of a monster-type character, like a much more alien heritage. And at least in this timeline, Glory had been waging a war, I guess, against her demon heritage. That seems to have been what the conflict was. And it turned into the kind of war where she was set on wiping the other side out. And that's, I guess, part of just, like, what her character is in this version. And the battle had basically torn apart the Earth, sent it into a post-apocalyptic state. And towards the end of the conflict, apparently Supreme intervened, says, "This is your final warning," rushes in and tears her arm off. So again, we are not shying away from being pretty violent in this book, apparently. Then Supreme offers his hand as, like a token of mercy. So naturally, Glory has to rip his arm off in return, right? And yeah, like, pretty gory, like, crazily proportioned characters, and doesn't mind pushing things in kind of uncomfortable directions. So, hey, I think that's an interesting book. We'll put this back just for continuity. There we go. Anyway, for this one, though, that is going to do it. So thanks very much for watching, guys. If you got this far, don't forget to hit the like button, hit subscribe if you haven't already, and right about now you should be seeing a link to my Patreon, so if you want, you can go check that out as well. But yeah, that'll do it. Thanks again for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.